Welcome, everyone. I'm your host, Emerson Green. We've got a very special episode today. Most everyone who has listened to the podcast, or if you're watching this channel, knows who both my guests are. Philip Goff is a philosopher and consciousness researcher at Durham University, UK. He's the co-host of the second best podcast that talks about panpsychism, Mind Chat, as well as the author of Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, Galileo's Error, and a forthcoming book related to today's topic. Dustin Crummett is a philosopher who specializes in social and political philosophy, ethics, and the intersection of those fields and philosophy of religion. He's the co-author of Applied Ethics, An Impartial Introduction, and co-editor of the Routledge series Little Debates About Big Questions, as well as the co-author, along with Brian Cutter, of Psychophysical Harmony, A New Argument for Theism. So before we move on, is there anything else related to your current projects or past work that you want to mention? And both of you really need to update your websites, by the way.
I know, I really do. It's been on my to-do list for ages to update my website, but I've just so many things to do. But I'm gonna do that soon.
Yeah, I'll have a big update about what I'm doing these days in a couple weeks, after some things happen. But
well, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah, exactly. So, in the meantime, people should go subscribe to my YouTube channel. I guess that's where I can always direct people. But
right. So for the record, this will not be like a detailed exposition of the argument from Psychophysical Harmony. For that, you can watch or listen to my interviews with Dustin or with Brian. So before I hand it over to Dustin and he talks about his preferred explanation, I just wanted to briefly mention something related to why I wanted to host this conversation and why I find it interesting. So for a long time, I've defended the hypothesis of indifference. The idea that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to pain and pleasure, good and evil, value and disvalue, is a powerful hypothesis that explains a wide range of data, but it's not perfect. There are a few anomalies, and one striking anomaly is psychophysical harmony, and there are a few others that may come up today as well. Everyone here thinks psychophysical harmony is a good argument, so we won't really be at pains to detail why it's a good argument. We're more or less taking it as an assumption and sort of exploring the conceptual space from there. If you reject that starting point, then that's fine, but it's still good to know what your options are. So from there, we'll be proceeding comparatively. We'll be comparing a few different theories that posit what you might call a value selection effect. They factor the goodness of the outcome into the explanation of why it happened or why it exists. That it's valuable, that it's good is part of the real explanation. And without it, the explanation will never be complete. So why talk about those kinds of theories? Mainly because of phenomena like psychophysical harmony that are A, very valuable, and B, very improbable. We landed on this tiny slice of probability space that happens to be very good. And what the different proposed ideas that we'll be talking about have in common is that they think goodness plays a role in the complete explanation, that it's good is part of why it exists. And obviously the most common version of that sort of thinking is theistic in nature, but there are non-standard forms of theism, and there are even non-theistic value selection hypotheses, like natural teleology. So even if you disagree, it's worth exploring this conceptual space and working out the implications of going down certain paths, and just more fully appreciating the diverse views that could be held by atheists and others who reject perfect being theism. So with that, I want to hand it over to Dustin.
Yeah, so psychophysical harmony, if people have watched the videos that Emerson has done on this or have read our paper, they'll know basically that's just the fact that there's this rationally and semantically appropriate set of correlations between our conscious states and our behavioral dispositions and beliefs and judgments understood in functional terms, that sort of stuff. So we're disposed to pursue valuable experiences like pleasure, disposed to avoid disvaluable experiences like pain. We're disposed to say things like, oh, there's a yellow cylindrical object in my visual field, and in fact, I'm having a conscious experience as of a yellow cylindrical object. If there's something that it's like to be in an intentional state. People who believe in cognitive phenomenology, if there's something it's like to have a belief or a desire, say, then it turns out that phenomenology matches up with kind of a belief, desire, explanation of our actions. So I have belief that there's beer in the fridge phenomenology, and desire to have a beer phenomenology. And sure enough, I go to the beer and open it up. What we argue in the paper is that this is very, very surprising, very, very intrinsically unlikely on basically any view of philosophy of mind, which grants that consciousness exists and there's at least an epistemic gap between the physical and the qualitative, the facts about consciousness. So even on forms of physicalism, which grant that there is an epistemic gap, which is so-called type B physicalism or whatever, this is what's accepted by most physicalists. We say that there's still a problem. We say that it's not avoided by belief in mental causation. It's not avoided by belief in evolution, despite the fact that that's what everybody on the internet thinks. To see why it's puzzling, it's easiest to see to start with like epiphenomenalist dualism. So the mental and the physical are distinct, and the mental doesn't have any causal impact on the world. And then you can easily see like, well, consciousness could have been distributed over physical states any which way. Could have been that pain and pleasure were inverted. Could have been that I just have like static white noise phenomenology in my visual field. Could have been that I had some wild set of belief, desire, psychology, phenomenology things. And I would have behaved exactly the same because the mental doesn't causally influence the physical on epiphenomenalism. And once you think about like all the different kinds of ways that these things could be hooked up, it turns out only the tiniest slice of possible correlations are harmonious. The simplest correlations also don't seem harmonious. They're, maybe just everything is the same boring buzzing noise or something. And so there's a real puzzle about how it is that we landed on the harmonious set of correlations. As I say, we argue, I won't give the argument for this here, but we argue that this remains puzzling even if we accept other views besides epiphenomenalist dualism. And what we say is, well, the psychophysical harmony is valuable. It makes possible all sorts of, and maybe it's valuable in and of itself, just that you're responding rationally to things, etc. It makes possible all sorts of agency. It would be kind of almost like kind of a pathetic world if you were cowering before, evaluatively neutral states, or, I really want to do something nice for my fiance, but that actually causes her terrible pain or something like that, right? And so we have this thing that seems like massively improbable, massively finely tuned in a certain sense. And it's also really significant. It's really valuable. And so what that suggests is that this wasn't just, oh, we got super lucky, but that the universe is in some way oriented towards the production of value, right? Somehow that's built into the psychophysical laws. There might be other pieces of evidence that suggest that too, but one way that the universe could be oriented towards the production of value is if God exists and God made the universe and decided that the psychophysical laws would be as they are. So what we say in the paper is, okay, this at least supports theism over, say, the hypothesis of indifference. There may be other views on which the universe is somehow oriented towards value. And it might be that to distinguish between theism and those, we need to appeal to other considerations, right, besides just psychophysical harmony. So what we advance in the paper is theism as an explanation, though it may be that there are other things which explain psychophysical harmony just as well, and to support theism we'll need to get into other stuff. And I imagine that we probably will get into other stuff in this conversation, but that's how Brian and I are thinking about it, more or less.
And do you want to briefly mention why you think theism might have an advantage over like a limited God hypothesis or natural teleology? I mean, we can hand it over to Philip if you want him to kick it off, but
well, I could. I was thinking we would just get into that later after Philip has said his piece, maybe.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think there's something really, really important here, and I mean, it's actually something I've been pressing for a while. I had a paper in in 2017 in the philosophical journal Philosophical Quarterly, called Conscious Thought and the Cognitive Fine-Tuning Problem, pressing something like this challenge. So I tend to call it the consciousness fine-tuning problem, or the cognitive fine-tuning problem. And I mean, I think most philosophers just kind of haven't really noticed it yet, and I think it is quite a subtle problem. Much more subtle and difficult to get than the more familiar hard problem of consciousness. But I do think it has pretty radical implications. I mean, another difference to the hard problem of consciousness is I think it has even more radical implications than that problem. You know, I think maybe you can address the hard problem of consciousness with a bit of panpsychism or a bit of naturalistic dualism, and you know, people used to think that was a bit weird, but I think, you know, once you get used to it, it's not that much of a departure from our standard scientific worldview. Whereas I think what this problem demands is a much more significant departure from the normal way we think about things. So yeah, I think Dustin's laid it out very clearly there. I mean, so I think the core of the problem for me, maybe I'm just repeating a little bit here, is that conscious experience and behavior on the whole is partnered up in a rationally appropriate way. So the clearest example is pain tends to cause you to avoid things. You know, your body feeling pain, it causes you to avoid the source of the pain. A conscious attraction to something causes you to go and get it. And, you know, I think that's such an obvious, mundane fact of life. I think that's why people don't get this problem, because that is just like, what? It's just so obvious. Obviously, if something hurts, you're going to avoid it. If you're yearning for something, you're going to go and get it. It's so obvious that it seems like it doesn't need explaining. But if, as 60% of philosophers believe from the recent Phil Papers survey, if there's at least a conceptual difference between conscious experience and behavior, then it does need explaining, right? I mean, we could go more into that, or as you say, it's been done in other videos, but I think it does need explaining. And as I say, 60% of philosophers think this, and you know, that doesn't prove anything. You know, it's not a popularity contest, but I think, you know, philosophers disagree so much when there's that much of a consensus on an issue. I think it's at least should give us pause to thought. I get that figure, by the way, by adding up the anti-physicalists who think zombies are possible and the so-called type B physicalists who think zombies are conceivable but not possible. So they both agree basically that there's a radical conceptual difference between conscious states and behavior or physical functional states, and that's all you need really to get this mystery going. And I mean, the other crucial thing that Dustin pointed to is, and it's always the immediate reaction, evolution does not help with this. Natural selection rather does not help. If you think natural selection solves this, you don't get the problem, and that's fair enough. It is a bit of a subtle problem, and the simple reason it doesn't solve the problem is any natural selection explanation presupposes a solution to this, right? Natural selection has only got a motivation, as it were, to make you feel pain when your body's damaged, if that's going to make you avoid getting your body damaged. Or natural selection's only got a motivation to make you yearn for food, if that's going to make you go get food. But that's already presupposing what we're trying to explain, namely that feeling pain is going to tend to make you avoid. Yearning for something's going to tend to make you go for it. That behavior and consciousness are aligned in this rationally appropriate way. So it is a really deep problem. Okay, I think the core of it is the reason it has such radical implications is we face a choice, right? Either it's just sheer fluke that consciousness and behavior are aligned in this rationally appropriate way, or that somehow rational norms are built in to the fundamental fabric of reality, right? And I think it's just so implausible that it's a fluke. I mean, I often find actually sort of you kind of new atheist types sometimes think, there's something brave about embracing improbability. I'm not scared of saying it's just a fluke, but it's, if something is so improbable, it's not brave, it's irrational, right? You shouldn't believe improbable things, right? So I think there is a very strong pressure here to some kind of view according to which rationality is, the norms of rationality are somehow, reality is somehow directed towards what is rationally appropriate. Okay, so God, as Dustin says, God is one way of doing that. I'm not a fan of the omni-God, at least. All-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, because the problem of evil. So the way the view I go for to solve this problem in my book, which I've just handed in a few days ago, the final copy. This is why I haven't updated my website or done a million other things. I have a huge relief to finish that. Anyway, the view I go for as an alternative to theism to solve this problem, which I think is a little more elegant, is what I call pan-agentialism. So I'll maybe just finish by spending a couple of minutes explaining this. So the bare bones of this actually were in my last book, Galileo's Error, in the kind of experimental final chapter. I had a little section on free will, and I kind of just thought it was a crazy, interesting thing to think about, but didn't take it very seriously. And one of my colleagues, Louise Hansen, who's now at Oxford, said, "Oh, you should write it up as an article." So I published this article, Panpsychism and Free Will, where I sort of developed a bit more, and then I've sort of developed it much more in my new book. But the reason I take it much more seriously now is I thought, this is actually, I think, a really good solution to this consciousness fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony problem, whatever you want to call it. Okay, sorry, I'll get on with the pan-agentialism. So it's a kind of panpsychism, right? You've got consciousness at the fundamental level. Let's say, for the sake of simplicity, we've got particles at the fundamental level, and they have very, very simple forms of experience. Okay, so that's the panpsychism. What pan-agentialism adds to that is that there's one and only one causal principle. Very simple unified theory here. One and only one very simple causal principle that determines everything that happens. Namely, all physical entities respond rationally to the character of their experience, right? So on the pan-agentialist view, nothing is ever compelled to behave. So it's very different to how we normally think about causation. You think it's the 1 billion ball hits another, compels the second to shoot off across the table. Nothing is ever compelled to do anything on this view. Okay, so if nothing's ever compelled to do anything, why do we get particles behaving in nice, predictable ways? Well, the thought is that particles have conscious inclinations to behave in certain ways. What do I mean by a conscious inclination? Well, the kind of thing you feel when you're consciously yearning for something. You're really hungry or you're really tired. The particle has a much simpler version of that, right? The particle just thinks kind of, I want to do this now. Right, so a kind of almost unimaginatively simple form of that. Doesn't seem any conceptual limit to me to how simple a conscious yearning could be. It's obviously much more simple than in the human case. Okay, now if you're a normal functioning adult human and you yearn for something, you can kind of deliberate about it, and you can think, is this a good idea? Maybe I shouldn't have the chocolate because I'm on a diet or whatever. But particles can't rationally deliberate, right? Particles, I think, have no understanding of anything, right? They just feel, I want to do this now. And so I want to say the only rational response available to them is the simplest rational response, namely, do what you feel like, right? I think that is a rational response. It's rational to do what you feel like doing, but that's the only rational response available to particles. So therefore, it's inevitable that particles are going to follow their conscious inclinations, and thus they behave in predictable ways. Okay, so that's what's going on at the fundamental level. Then what you find after a long period of evolution, when you get something like a tiger, there are two ways in which a tiger is different to a particle. Obviously, there's lots of ways in which a tiger is different from a particle. It's furry and so on. But for our purposes, two crucial ways in which they're different. One is that the tiger has conscious understanding of the world around it, of of that there are other tigers and that there are various spatio-temporal locations and there's things it wants to eat and things it can eat and so on. So it has conscious understanding of the world around it. And secondly, whereas the particle's desires are just do this now, the objects of desire of the tiger are embedded in its complex understanding of the world around it, right? So it wants to mate, it wants to eat, it wants to sleep, and these things are embedded in the world around it as represented by the tiger. So it's much more sophisticated conscious relationship with the world around it, and because of that, it has much richer rational responses available to it. When a tiger rationally responds to its experience, it's a much more sophisticated thing. But crucially, the idea is the commonality is both the particle and the tiger are acting from exactly the same disposition or capacity, namely a disposition to respond rationally to experience. It's just that the particle can't do much with that because it doesn't understand anything, whereas the tiger's much more sophisticated mental life, that impulse is going to give you a lot more, is going to be flower in a much more sophisticated response. Okay, so that's roughly the view. Why believe this crazy view? Basically, I think with this view in place, you then just need natural selection. Once that's in place, you just need natural selection, because now natural selection has a motivation to give organisms a complex conscious understanding of the world around them, and desires embedded in that, because they're going to respond rationally to that understanding, and it's going to help them survive better. So once you've got pan-agentialism in place, you don't need God, you don't need anything like that. You just need normal natural selection. So natural selection. So it's not that I don't think we've evolved through natural selection. I think we have done, but we need something like pan-agentialism in place in order to make sense of that. Maybe it's a kind of, I'm just thinking now, maybe it's a kind of like transcendental argument in the Kantian sense. Kant had these transcendental arguments. He said, we need to believe in this view because it's presupposed by other things we believe in, very roughly. I mean, I did talk about this in my book and I took it out because I don't know anything about Kant. Anyway, that's the kind of idea. It's, we accept that we evolve through natural selection, and this kind of pan-agentialism view is we need to presuppose that to make sense of that. Otherwise, we bang up against the consciousness fine-tuning problem or the psychophysical harmony problem. I'm using those interchangeably. Okay, that's about where I'm up to on this. Sorry, it was a bit longer than I expected.
So it's like you see physical reality as sort of like a network of conscious agents all responding rationally to their experiences from the bottom level up to where we are now.
Yeah, so it's not. So we talked about in your introductory thing, Emerson, you said that there needs to be like a push towards the good. So the way that works out, in my view, is that there's a push towards the rational, in the sense that every physical entity is disposed to respond rationally. Because that's the, I mean, look, what's the issue with psychophysical harmony? The simplest case, pain tends to lead us to avoid things, pleasure to go for things. That's a rational response, right? So the simplest way to make sense of that is, well, things are just disposed to respond rationally. That's the simple idea, really.
Right. So this is like a simple theory that explains the data, has like a reasonable prior probability, and then it arguably gets a big probability boost from the data of psychophysical harmony, which is like roughly what Dustin is saying about theism. Yeah. So maybe this would be, I mean, Dustin, you can jump in with whatever you want, but we could start comparing the theories at this point, perhaps.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, I guess, right? It could be that theism is true and pan-agentialism is true. It might even be, if pan-agentialism is an elegant, simple way of bringing about psychophysical harmony, maybe that would be a very reasonable thing for God to do, right? Make pan-agentialism be true. So yeah, I wouldn't necessarily have to reject it. And I think Philip is sympathetic to the thought that there are other things about the world, like physical fine-tuning, that require that we posit some kind of value orientation beyond just what's provided by pan-agentialism. So, it could be that we say, yeah, maybe pan-agentialism is true. Maybe that's compatible with theism. We still need to say something else. And then we still need to get into this question about omni-God versus limited God versus teleological laws, whatever. Yeah, so I don't hate pan-agentialism. I guess one thing to say is it is pretty counterintuitive. And I guess it will be more counterintuitive if you don't already accept panpsychism, which I don't already accept panpsychism. Once you're already attributing mindedness to fundamental entities, it's not a big step to also attribute some sort of basic agency or rationality. I guess, and I think having heard what Philip just said, I think maybe I know what he'll say in response to this. But one thought I had reading his chapter in the book is that I wonder if there isn't a kind of analog of the combination problem for like ordinary panpsychism here. So you think, okay, the fundamental particles are they have consciousness and they're disposed to behave rationally in accordance with their desires and stuff. That doesn't seem to entail anything about macro level consciousness just immediately, right? That seems compatible with us being zombies or us being inverts or whatever. You might, or us having evaluatively neutral states, or that doesn't tell you anything about what the macro level conscious properties are going to be like or how they're going to be distributed. So you might have the worry that it will almost be like you'll need some set of further bridge laws, like sui generis bridge laws, that will say something like, okay, when the fundamental particles are doing what they want to do, and they're in this functional organization, then, this harmonious macro level physical state occurs or whatever. And once you have those bridge laws in place, you could go through and strike out the part about the fundamental particles doing what they want to do, right? I think that Philip's response to that, having heard what he just said, I think Philip's response to that will be pan-agentialism has an advantage because actually you just need this one fundamental unifying principle saying that all physical systems well, actually, let me just ask what Philip has to say about that. I won't. There's no reason to guess. He's right here.
Yeah. I also want to talk about the sort of more general stuff you raised at the start, but maybe I'll start with what you've just said. This is going to have to be a non-reductionist form of panpsychism. So there are reductionist forms of panpsychism where basically there are just conscious particles, and what we call Emerson's mind is just a complex combination of conscious particles. So it's a bit like a party is nothing over and above people dancing and drinking and stuff. That's just all it is for there to be a party. We just use the word party to refer to a group of people. So similarly, on the reductionist panpsychist view, what we just use Emerson's mind to refer to this collection of conscious particles. So I'm less and less sympathetic to that kind of very reductionist panpsychism that, for example, Luke Roelofs has done very well at defending. So it's going to have to be a more strong emergentist form of panpsychism where, no, the conscious particles have capacities to combine into a unified whole. And the unified whole is something more than the sum of the parts. I mean, part of the idea here is we're explaining how we evolved. And so it's gonna have to make a difference to how we behave. I mean, this is part of how I set it up in the book, actually, that I set it up in the first instance in opposition to a kind of micro reductionist picture where it's just physics running the show. But then it really is mysterious how we got to evolve the kind of consciousness we have, because if it's just the physics running the show, then we would have behaved the same, whatever consciousness popped up, right? So I think you really need consciousness when it emerges to make a difference. I mean, not just consciousness, but the particular kind of consciousness we have that involves rational understanding and stuff. It has to make a difference. So yeah, so I think this is going to have to be a non-reductionist form. And as you say, Dustin, exactly, there's going to have to be some extra. You could do it in terms of extra laws of nature that just make it the case that in certain circumstances, conscious particles become a unified whole. I prefer sort of thinking of it in terms of combinatorial capacities of the particles. But anyway, but one thing I don't agree with that you said is that those extra laws or capacities are going to mention harmony. I don't think you have to have into the laws that, it's going to make a harmonious whole, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to suggest that they would say anything about harmony de dicto. It's just they would imply harmony. Yeah,
they would make a whole, because then I think we can bring natural selection in, because natural selection, if natural selection has a motivation to give us rational understanding of the world around us, on the assumption that we're going to respond rationally to that and survive well. So we don't need extra laws of nature to do anything with harmony. So then just moving to the big picture, I think, yeah, it is, as you say, compatible with theism. But I mean, yeah, even if you're theist, you have to say how God did it, right? And what's the alternative to what I'm proposing? I mean, you could have just God like micromanaging everything. What's the who's the guy, the Cartesian guy who what do we call this? I've forgotten the term for it.
Occasionalism.
Yeah, that's it. Occasionalism, right? Or you know, I mean, I guess you and Brian could go for sort of psychophysical laws, but what do those laws look like? Do you? I don't think you have, as far as I've heard, any kind of elegant story of what it seems to me. The laws are going to have to be incredibly complicated, whereas I think what I've got here is a pretty simple story, and also I think it makes God a bit redundant, right? Because you don't. I don't think you need to add God for psychophysical harmony. As you say, I also think cosmological fine-tuning is an issue, and I don't think pan-agentialism can address that. So we need to add something else, and we could talk about what that might be. But if, for example, I think Emerson said in Twitter conversations that he's really motivated by this psychophysical harmony stuff, but not necessarily by cosmological fine-tuning, well then, if I were in his position, I would just go for pan-agentialism, because I think that's a really simple, elegant way of doing the job, and God isn't really necessary then. I don't see why you'd. So yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah. So let's see. So I guess one thing to say is, in terms of the psychophysical laws, what is our account of the psychophysical laws? I mean, in terms of what they are, I guess just any account of what laws of nature are, we could employ, right? How complicated they'll be, I guess will be, that will depend on like how, whether it's possible to reduce our conscious experiences to like a small number of simple experiences that can be mixed and matched and whatever. But I guess my thought is that once you go non-reductionist panpsychism, you're going to have an analogous problem with whatever, I mean, specifying maybe what the combinatorial properties of the particles, how they come to generate macro level agents with, macro level subjects with, or agents in this case, with, their own novel sorts of conscious experiences and things. I'm not quite convinced that there's going to be more complexity one way or another there. So, I mean, maybe one thought I've had with panpsychism before is if you go reductionist, then the view seems implausible. If you go non-reductionist, then the panpsychism part seems less helpful because you still need these other things governing what happens at the macro level. And why not then just say, oh, okay, well, let's just have those things at the macro level, and you don't need the more, the mentality at the fundamental level. That's not a super developed thought, but that's kind of a first pass response to that. I do agree, yeah. If we think pan-agentialism is a good explanation of this, then it might render God unnecessary. There might still be some sense in which I think it would be evidence for theism in the sense that maybe pan-agentialism, if it's a nice, elegant explanation of psychophysical harmony or whatever, like that, then maybe pan-agentialism being the case would be more likely if theism is true than if atheism is true, right? So it could still be evidence for theism, but it's true then if you were just deciding between pan-agentialism and theism, and we agree that pan-agentialism is an adequate explanation, then I agree, yeah, we would have to appeal to other things.
At that point, I'd have to put my grandmoppy hat on and dispute what you said about, because wouldn't just pan-agentialism be like the simpler theory there, as opposed to pan-agentialism plus God?
Maybe. Yeah, it will depend. Sorry, I don't think you would be disputing what I said. So what I said was,
I also don't know why it would be evidence for theism exactly.
Because it's this, as per hypothesis, this simple, elegant way of bringing about this very valuable state of affairs. If that turns out to be the case, it seems likelier to be the case that the world will be structured in this simple, elegant way that brings about this valuable state of affairs if there's a God that made the world than if there's not, because that includes lots of conceivable scenarios where there's no sort of orientation towards value, and so there's no reason to expect that we have this simple, elegant mechanism that produces a lot of value. In terms of deciding just between pan-agentialism and theism, which one would it be simpler to be a pan-agentialist or to be like a theist who thinks that God brought pan-agentialism about? I think it gets to be a little bit tricky. There's some sense, of course, in which, well, the theist believes in an extra thing. So like in some sense, it's more complicated. I think what matters when we do like worldview comparisons of this sort is something like simplicity at like the fundamental explanatory level. And so then really the question would be like, what is simpler between, say, the omni-God, which I think Philip agrees is like a very simple theory of God, or a physical universe of the sort that we find, maybe, or the singularity or whatever, which is also governed by pan-agentialism in addition to other laws that are not entailed by pan-agentialism. I'm not sure that the pan-agentialist view, once we think about the other things that pan-agentialist needs to build in fundamentally, if they don't say that there's some deeper explanation, I'm not sure that that's simpler. And then, of course, there might be other pieces of evidence for and against either of these views too, right? So Philip will say, well, one piece of evidence against the omni-God is the problem of evil, and maybe we'll talk about that at some point. But
I think I agree with Emerson there. I mean, it's like, okay, so the pan-agentialist view is just, stuff is rational. And then what theism is this rational mind. Okay, I can see that, rational stuff is more likely if there's a rational mind. But that to my mind is like saying, okay, God is more likely if there's another God that created it or something. I mean, I think there doesn't seem to be much explanatory advantage going from stuff is rational to there is this rational mind that created it. Although I see you get into the Swinburne view that, okay, theism is just really simple. I sort of feel like that's straying into maybe a slightly different argument. But again, coming back to the I don't think the laws for pan-agentialism would necessarily be complex. I mean, as I say in the book, I'm quite sympathetic to the integrated information theory for philosophical rather than empirical reasons. And I think that seems pretty simple, right? You just, when you've got maximal integrated information in a whole, like more in the whole than the parts, then you get consciousness. So you plug that into this kind of non-reductionist panpsychism, strong emergence panpsychism, that would just be a sort of basic causal principle that when conscious particles form a system where there's more integrated information in the whole than the parts, they form a unified conscious whole. That seems pretty simple. Whereas, and then as I say, evolution works to sort of shape rational understanding. Whereas, if you and Brian are just sort of postulating laws to make it that, pain, make you behave in the right rationally responsive way to pain and the rationally responsive way to seeing a cup. I mean, obviously it's not going to be that particular, but I don't know. I struggle to see how you'd kind of systematize it in that simple, elegant way. But I also want to say, so as I say, if you're just with psychophysical harmony, I just go for panagentialism. But one thing I talk about in the book is how, if you do believe in cosmological fine-tuning, they sort of work together to give strength to some kind of big explanatory demand, because they seem to fit together very, very well. Because without cosmological fine-tuning, so you've just got this rational matter, but without cosmological fine-tuning, it looks like it's not going to be able to do very much. You're just going to be stuck with very simple particles doing what they feel like doing, right? It's only, the cosmological fine-tuning tells us to get any kind of interesting chemistry, you need fine-tuning, and it looks like you need that to get evolved organisms that can reach a higher form of rationality, that can respond in a rationally appropriate way to their understanding of the universe. So it's almost like rational matter. So the panagentialist postulates rational matter, and it sort of has built into it this potential for flowering into the kind of rationality humans exhibit. But that would not be possible without cosmological fine-tuning. So, and to put it the other way around, if you just had cosmological fine-tuning and you didn't have rational matter, then I think you wouldn't have psychophysical harmony. So either way, so it's like you need both rational matter and cosmological fine-tuning to get the kind of full flowerings of rationality that we find in human beings. So that does in itself, I think, push you towards something goddish. But as you say, for reasons of the problem of evil, I don't like the omni-god. I think there are other alternatives, but that's how I see it. So just just psychophysical harmony wouldn't necessarily push you towards something goddish, but together with cosmological fine-tuning, it amplifies the fine-tuning argument for something goddish, I think. That's how I see it.
Just to retread some ground that we just covered, you mentioned that you think Luke Roloffs can't be a pan-agentialist. Is that a sure thing in your mind?
Yeah, I think so. I think Luke could agree with that. I mean,
okay,
Luke's great because he's the most sort of reductionist, atheistic, secular panpsychist you can get. He's totally, which is great. He's really good. He does it really well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think he's got that very reductionist picture. So it's crucial for the panagent. I mean, I don't know. Maybe there are other ways of understanding panagentialism, but the point is, there's a kind of fundamental causation at the level of the organism, maybe the organism's brain. I would think of it as the organism's brain, that the tiger is rationally responding to its understanding, and that is a fundamental kind of causation. Because to my mind, it's got to make a difference for natural selection to be interested in it. If it was just physics, natural selection wouldn't be interested in giving us psychophysical harmony, in giving us conscious understanding. It's got to make a difference. So there's got to be a fundamental causal processes going on at the level of the organism. The organism's rational responsiveness to its environment is on this view a fundamental form of causation. And yeah, that Luke Roloff's is totally reductionist. He's so I don't think he would go. I think he'd agree with that.
So you think we need to go in for like non-reductive panpsychism, where it's sort of more like redrawing the boundaries around subjects as they come together. But I think Dustin pointed out, Dustin made an interesting point about, well, if you do have to invoke something like non-reductive panpsychism, then doesn't that kind of undermine some of the motivation for panpsychism to begin with? If you're going to invoke something like strong emergence, then why not just be a dualist and go in for the more intuitive view? One response to that is that it doesn't seem like the pan-agentialist view could work with dualism. So that might be a reason to still go with panpsychism over dualism if pan-agentialism only works with panpsychism and pan-agentialism helps solve psychophysical harmony.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, just in terms of just forgetting all the psychophysical harmony stuff, just in terms of panpsychism. So this is a point that's often made. If I think maybe this is kind of connected to what Dustin said earlier. If you're going to have this non-reductionist view, why not just be a David Chalmers style dualist where there's just basic laws that kick in when you just got bog standard non-conscious particles, and then basic laws that kick in when they get in certain arrangements. And yeah, my response to that is just that panpsychism is more parsimonious, right? I had this argument with Brian Cutter on another podcast. Dualism believes in two kinds of stuff. Panpsychism only believes in one kind of stuff. So to put it another way, I think panpsychism earns its value by reducing the physical world to consciousness, right? That's that you've just got consciousness, and that I'm sure I won't go into it now unless you want me to. The physical world emerges from underlying facts about consciousness. So that's the explanatory value. That's the theoretical value of panpsychism, reducing the physical world to facts about consciousnness. If you can also do some more reductive work, if the Roloff picture worked, that would be amazing. That would be a bonus. I've got a forthcoming paper, How Exactly Does Panpsychism Explain Consciousness, where I sort of have a partial reductionist picture. So that would give us some parsimony gains. But even if you can't do that, even if biological consciousness is sort of radically new, you've still earned your keep by reducing the physical world. So I still think it's more parsimonious than dualism. But as you said, once we're bringing in psychophysical harmony, then we've got a really hardcore reason to go for panpsychism, I think, because it helps with this. The pan-agentialist, it allows us to be pan-agentialist, which helps explain psychophysical harmony.
Can I say something about the IIT stuff? So I guess, of course, you all know this, but it does seem like we do get into maybe a trade-off between simplicity and some of our ordinary intuitions about what sorts of things are conscious. It's already pretty weird to most people to think that electrons are conscious, but then IIT maybe implies that like light switches are, or that I could cease being conscious by being related in the right way to some bigger system that has a higher degree of integrated information merely by making this extrinsic change to me. So IIT does have some odd implications. I guess I would be inclined to think it doesn't quite immediately allow you to generate macro level consciousness either, because it doesn't tell you like what sorts of conscious states are going to be happening. It just tells you that what systems are conscious and like the degree of consciousness, right? So you'll maybe need some further, if not bridge laws, something else to add to the theory to get that. And then maybe another thought is, Swinburne has this argument that, oh yeah, the psychophysical laws are going to be super complicated and arbitrary seeming. And like what that tells you is there has to be some deeper explanation, right? So this is an argument for theism because God God has reason to want to make embodied beings. God could be responsible for these complicated laws. We know they're too complicated, like things this complicated are intrinsically improbable, particularly when they work out well in this very interesting way. So yeah, I guess maybe that could be summed up as IIT does have some pretty odd implications that we can avoid if we don't go that route. It does seem to me that we need a little bit more complication, at least, still to actually fill in the details about what conscious experiences are happening at the macro level. And maybe like the complicatedness of kind of dualistic bridge laws or whatever is not quite as bad if you're a theist, because you can give this deeper explanation of how it is that they exist and so forth. So yeah, those are some thoughts about that maybe.
Yeah, I mean, what I like about IIT is that it gives us non-vague answers to which things are conscious. It gives consciousness precise boundaries in the philosophical sense of the word vague, meaning there are fuzzy borderline cases where when I know you know this stuff, but just for any viewers who aren't familiar with that term. And so I think it couldn't be. So there's a great recent paper by Eric Schwitzgebel coming on my podcast, Mind Chat, as you say, Emerson, the second best podcast connected to panpsychism, to talk about this in May. He thinks that it could be that there's no fact of the matter as to whether or not a snail is conscious. So it's not that it's like got a little bit of consciousness. It's there's just no fact of the matter as to whether it's just an unfeeling mechanism or whether it's got an inner life. And I don't think that makes sense. I think either it's got an inner life, maybe a very simple kind, maybe a very alien kind, but either it's got an inner life or it's just an unfeeling mechanism. And the only theory that can give us that, that there's always a fact of the matter is IIT. Because if you take, for example, global workspace theory, where something's conscious if it's about, the information being broadcast enough through different systems in the brain, presumably there's not going to be any exact cutoff point where the information is broadcast just enough, right? So it looks like it's going to be, at some point it's going to be indeterminate whether or not a thing is conscious, maybe as, the fetus, the embryo becomes a baby or whatever, or whereas IIT has an utterly sharp cutoff. So that's what I like about it. I'm not wedded to it though, I'm just saying, for me, it's the only option, I think, the only of the current empirical options that passes that test, which is sort of a deal breaker for me. So it's like, it's the only view that passes my deal breaker test. But, I'm not saying it's perfect and, as you say, I think it's a fair point that it's not just combination. We want, how is it that the specifics of our consciousness gets generated, all the different sensory qualities we find, that our desires are sort of projected out in our understanding of the world. So yeah, I mean, I haven't a clue how we could start to make theoretical sense of that. I guess where I'd push back at Swinburne is like, I don't see a good argument that that's necessarily going to be complex. It's just that I don't know anyone who's figured out how to make sense of it yet, but maybe it just takes time or something. But yeah, there's certainly at the very least a big challenge there. Yeah,
I guess I agree about no vagueness in consciousness. I guess here's another view, which I guess is what I think. There's some sort of like kind of arbitrary looking boundary where systems become conscious. And and it's going to look, from the perspective of a physicalist theory, it's going to look arbitrary, and maybe that's a problem for a physicalist theory, because it should be some necessary truth when there's consciousness on physicalism. And but in my view, well, there's like a contingent natural law that kicks in at some stage. And well, why did it kick in at that stage? Well, because God, that's how God personified it, and then that comports better, at least, with our intuitions about what sorts of things are conscious and maybe how consciousness behaves in certain cases and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I recently made an episode about vagueness arguments, and Dustin and I have talked about them before. And that was kind of the point I was waiting for someone to make, but everyone was too busy making the dumbest objections conceivable to the vagueness argument. So no one ever got around to saying, hey, wait a minute, you think that the boundaries of consciousness are kind of redrawn at different levels. Like, wherever you pick that, isn't it going to seem kind of arbitrary? And isn't it going to have to be a sharp cutoff when that does happen? And it's like, oh, now it doesn't seem like such a strong theoretical advantage. But nobody said that because they were too busy giving totally irrelevant analogies and so on. But
that's the great thing about IIT, that their cutoff doesn't seem so arbitrary.
Right, exactly. That would be the next step. But yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah. I guess my theory, I mean, maybe the view is IIT is true, but consciousness kicks in at a certain level that excludes light switches and things like that. Well, why does it kick in at that level? Because that's the level God picked. Maybe there wasn't any use in having conscious light switches, but there are use in having conscious cats and dogs and bugs and people, and
Yeah, I mean, I could certainly see like empirical advances, if that did turn out to be true, that it looked really arbitrary where it kicked in. Maybe that would start to point towards theism. But yeah, I just think we just understand so little about consciousness, and I don't see a really good argument that that's inevitable, that there couldn't end up being some pretty simple laws. Although it is hard to see how it. I mean, what they call in the panpsychism literature the palette problem, that there's just like all the different sensory qualities we find in experience that don't seem to have anything to do with each other. How do they all fit together in simple laws? So I can't quite get it, but I don't see a good argument that there couldn't be some simple principles that are just maybe beyond our understanding. Or
could I bring in a term that we somehow haven't mentioned yet? The term being axiarchism. I was thinking about, kind of presenting this as like, theism versus axiarchism or something like that, or theism versus natural teleology. Philip, could you unpack what is meant by axiarchism and natural teleology?
Yeah, so to take the latter first, maybe, I do think cosmological fine-tuning in conjunction with consciousness fine-tuning points to something God-ish, in the sense of some kind of goal-directedness in reality. I don't like the omni-God because of the problem of evil, but I think there are a number of alternatives. I'm open to non-standard designers. I'm open to a conscious universe. But one possibility is the one Thomas Nagel defended in his great 2012 book, Mind and Cosmos, which got horrible, unfair reviews because it was, I think if he'd just been defending theism, probably most people would have ignored it, and some people would have liked it, and but the fact that he didn't like God either, the fact that he wasn't fitting into nice categories, he was attacking theism and atheism and the standard secular view. He got very unfair, horrible views. Anyway, I'm digressing. So in that book he defended teleological laws. So there isn't a conscious mind directing stuff. There are these laws with purposes built into them. So whereas we standardly think of laws as kind of working from past to future, the laws, as it were, take what's happening now and then tell you what's going to happen a second later. I mean, that's a very crude picture. But teleological laws work from future to past. They determine what's happening now. Sorry, future to present, rather. they're determining what's happening now based on the need to get closer to a certain future goal. And that sounds a bit vague, but what Nagel does is build on a very, very rigorous, well-developed version of this by John Hawthorne and Daniel Nolan, which they weren't necessarily defending, but they were just interested in trying to cash this out. So yeah, so there's no conscious mind running the universe, but there are goal-directed laws of nature. Axiarchism. I mean, one problem with this is you might still think, okay, we've got these laws pointing us at certain goals. How come the goals they're pointing at, maybe life, rationality, are really good things? You know, couldn't the goals have been directed towards, you know, something bad, or just, sorry, bit of fizziness of the beer, or just, you know, polka dotted universe or something? How come they're really good things? You might think that pushes you back to God. But an alternative is some kind of axiarchism where we just say, no, there's just a fundamental push in the universe towards the good. So maybe the teleological laws have those goals because they are good, but that's just the end of the story. So, you know, everyone has to stop their explanation somewhere. You know, the atheist might just take cosmological fine-tuning as just brute. Then teleological laws take it another level of explanation. Then axiarchism might say, okay, the teleological laws have their goals because they're good, but that's the end of it. It's not like there's some God who is interested in goodness. It's just, but I mean, the axiarchism originally came from John Leslie, one of the most important books on fine-tuning universes, where he had a really sort of radical axiarchic position where the universe exists because it is good. So there's no kind of God to ultimate creator, but the universe exists because it's good, but that's just the bottom level of explanation. I worry that will get us back to the problem of evil. So I would go for a kind of partial, if I'm going to go for teleological laws, I would have a kind of partial axiarchism where the push towards the good is playing some role in shaping the universe, but there's also arbitrary laws of physics that are making things arbitrary or even bad just because of the randomness. So that was a bit long-winded, but yeah.
So, Dustin, I know that you've said in the past that if there were teleological laws of nature kind of, you know, pushing us towards certain outcomes, that you might view that as evidence for theism. But I'm curious what you guys think about teleological evil. We were talking about this a little bit before we got started because, you know, Philip, you say like, well, you know, why wouldn't there be, you know, because it's totally conceivable that there could be teleological laws, you know, goal-directed laws where things are aiming towards bad outcomes, you know, like, so why aren't there those things? Why isn't there teleological evil or perhaps evil natural laws? And some people have argued that there are some of those in our universe, you know, like Quentin Smith wrote a paper called something called Evil Natural Laws. And Felipe Leon has a post. This is also in a book that he co-wrote with Josh Rasmussen, where he talks about teleological evil. So, I mean, it does seem to me that there is some teleological evil, you know, which definitely doesn't seem to make for a nice fit for theism. You know, if you're thinking of an all-good, all-knowing, all-powerful creator, you know, unlimited in power, who made everything ex nihilo, and then there are these evil natural laws. It just seems like totally bizarre, like why that would exist. So I'm curious what you think about that, Dustin, and also Philip.
Yeah. So I guess maybe while we're on the topic of axiarchism, I guess I just want to flag there is maybe like a simplicity versus fit with data trade-off here too. You know, the simplest version of axiarchism would maybe be something just like things go the way that would be best, and that probably, to my mind, entails omnitheism, because wouldn't it be best if there was an omnitheist God, right? But then you run into the same problem with the problem of evil, right? So there's going to be a little bit, it's almost like Philip and I maybe are going to reverse our positions here, because he says, I say, oh, panpsychism has these odd implications, and he says, oh, but it's simpler. Here, I think the views that I'm defending are going to wind up being simpler, but then you have the problem of evil, right? So, well, I think we're going to return to that in a minute. But I had that thought while we're on the topic. But yeah, teleological evil. Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, it does seem that some things are are understanding their function in like the way that an evolutionary biologist would, or whatever. It seems that their function is bad. Yeah, so I agree with that. How might a theist respond? I mean, well, they're all the common things that you might say in response to the problem of evil. I mean, I guess my own view, I have this paper about the simulation hypothesis where I talk about views that it turns out that natural evils are all moral evils of some sort, right? That's the direction that I'm inclined to go in. I mean, I guess the view that you find in the New Testament seems to be that like the world is held in bondage to the forces of evil, where that means not only like billionaires and structural racism, but actual like ontological, evil archons. And I mean, maybe that's what I think. Not that they're directly intervening all the time, of course. You have questions about how to make that view plausible. How could that fit with our knowledge of the natural history of the world, all that kind of stuff. And of course, you also then have the question, well, why doesn't God just stomp those guys? Why does he allow that? And maybe it's something to do with free will or creaturely agency or whatever. I guess I think my inclination is, I talk about some other possibilities in that paper, but my inclination is to think, yeah, there is teleological evil. That's not part of God's plan A, so to speak. That's the result of things getting mucked up somehow. And maybe part of our destiny is to try to undo some of that. Emerson and I have gone back and forth before on wild animal suffering. There are these effective altruist people who think in the long run, really, we should be trying to like look into ways that we might improve the condition of wild animals, because it is an awful system that causes all this suffering, and its ordinary functioning is horrible in many ways for so many individuals. And maybe what we need to do is correct that somehow, if we can do so in a way that's prudent and blah blah blah. And yeah, I guess I think, yeah, that's right. There is teleological evil, and I hope that someday we can do more about it.
I'm resisting talking about the animal suffering thing, but
I love the simulation theodicy, though. I enjoyed you speaking, Dustin, on the Relay Theology podcast, and as you mentioned, Barry Dainton published on this, and I saw him give the talk on this on the simulation before he published it, and the simulation theodicy. It was at a conference in honor of Howard Robinson, the great idealist Howard Robinson, on his retirement. And I did think that's the best theodicy. But I mean, I am a very find the problem being very compelling, but I do think that's the best theodicy I've heard. That we're in a simulation, and the evils are the result of the evil simulators. But yeah, I guess I would. Well, I mean, I'd love to ask you more about it. Really, as you said there, struggle to see, how that would fit in with the world as we find it, apart from the simulation version of it. What these evil forces, I don't know. I just find it. I suppose if you had to, if I thought tomorrow I woke up and I thought the ontological argument works, and there is an omnigod, so there must be an explanation of why they're suffering, I guess I might go for something like that. It seems to me the most plausible version. But in the absence of some compelling reason, I think, fine tuning we can do with something that's a bit goddish, but not the omnigod. So I don't find any compelling reason to have to take that route. I see what you're saying as the simplicity push, but anyway, we're probably preempting some other arguments. But
So do you both take it then that moral evil is like significantly easier to explain than natural evil? Because it seems like that's kind of like an assumption for the simulation theodicy to really have any force.
I guess I mean, I think so. I'm aware, of course, there are many questions that remain. It theoretically, someday Philip Swenson and I are going to write a book about this. So until then, I can just punt to the future when I'll have super compelling things to say about all the worries people have. But yeah, my inclination is to think that moral evil is easier to explain.
It's a good question. I'm not sure what I think about that. I guess I always just focus on natural evil because that does seem the thing that's more challenging to explain. And there does seem there is a prima facie something plausible about free will in the moral case. But I'm not sure I think that's entirely convincing either. But I suppose I never really think about it that much because I just think, oh no, natural evil is obviously is really compelling, and so I haven't thought as much about how the free will defense goes. I think I probably would think that there's a big challenge there as well, but I should probably think about it more actually.
Well, I mean, I would refer to something that you said in a previous talk actually, where you said, oh, what if, we found out that I was running a simulation in my garage and like, the Holocaust happened and like slavery happened and all and factory farming was going on. And I said like, oh, hang on guys, I gave them free will. And like, still like, that might not be a compelling defense when you're in front of the ethics committee, at your university. Like,
I do agree. I mean, there are cases where it seems like I see somebody doing something bad, I should intervene, even though they're acting freely. So like, doesn't it follow that God should intervene, right? So yeah, it does seem like there has to be some relevant difference, some reason for God to like leave things up to the collective efforts of creatures or something like that, like justifies some sort of non-interventionist policy in cases where I should intervene if I'm there using my own free will. And that's what could justify that is one of the topics that Philip and I will address in our book when we write it someday, in a very compelling way. But
is there anything you guys want to touch on before we pivot to the limited God stuff a little more directly?
No, I think that would be the. How long are we going to go for? I guess is that what should we?
As long as you guys will let me take your time, I guess.
I'm really enjoying it, but my problem is with these things, I find it hard to wind down afterwards. So maybe maybe we can just do another like 20 minutes or so on the limited stuff. Is that all right?
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yes.
Maybe Philip should start by laying out his preferred version of the limited.
Yeah. So the teleological laws is one way to go, but I'm open to non-standard designer hypotheses, and I can see postulating a designer does give you a bit of extra explanatory depth. There does seem something a bit weird of just these goal-directed laws. Explaining them in terms of a conscious mind does give you a bit of explanatory depth, but why think the designer has to be all-powerful? So. I mean, I agree with, I can see the force of what Dustin's saying, echoing things Swinburne is well known for saying, that there's something very simple about the omni-God hypothesis, that all of the omni-God's characteristics are to the max, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, and there's something very simple about that, rather than if this arbitrary cutoff points were sort of a certain amount of power, but not that much. That's a less simple hypothesis. But I think we tend to think the important thing is fitting the data. Yes, you try and have the simplest theory you can, but in the goal of fitting the data. So Swinburne himself gives this example of, I'm taking his word for it. I don't know if I haven't checked this out, but he says that before we had any evidence to the contrary, we assumed the speed of light was infinite, because that's the simplest value, right? It's the simplest values are either 0 or infinite. But right, okay, and maybe that's right. But then as soon as we get some evidence to the contrary, we don't sort of sit around thinking, oh, how can we find a clever way of maintaining that the speed of light is infinite? We just say, no, it's that less precise value. So I think what we should do is, okay, maybe in some sense, the default position is the omni-God, if we're going to go for a designer hypothesis. As I say, I think there are other alternatives. But if we're going to go for a designer hypothesis, maybe the omni-God is the simplest. But as soon as we look at the data, i.e. the horrific things that happen in the world, you know, the fact that we came to exist through this torturous process of evolution by natural selection, you know, the everyday horrors of the natural world, you know, shrews that paralyze their prey and then eat it alive over several days. So then I think we should say, I think the best hypothesis, and I consider a number of non-standard design hypotheses in the book, but the one I think is the best is a good designer of limited powers. I mean, you might think at first, I think the most obvious alternative is a bad designer, but then as Stephen Law and others have pointed out, well, you get a problem of good. Why does the evil designer create all the nice things? And you've got the kind of mirror image of the problem. And then you could say, well, it's a designer that's neither good nor bad, but is sort of is like nice sometimes, but then gets a bit angry. But I think you can have some God with a, you know, really complex psychology, and that's going to be quite complicated. I think the next simplest hypothesis to the omni-God, the omni-designer, is just a good God who wants to create the best universe she can, but she's limited in what she can do. So let's say she can only create from a singularity. So she can't just create complex matter. She can't just create Adam by breathing into the dust, as we see depicted in Genesis. She can only create from a singularity, a universe with the right kind of physics that will eventually evolve intelligent life. And she knows it's going to cause loads of suffering and it's going to take millions of years. It's going to be horrible. She's like, I wish I could do it quicker, you know, but this is the best I can do. It's that or nothing. And so, you know, on balance, she thought, you know, it's better to have a universe like that than nothing at all. So, so that seems to me maybe not as simple as the omni-God, but it's fairly simple. You know, it's a fairly simple account of what she can and can't do. So, and it fits the data much better than the omni-God hypothesis. So, yeah, that's what I think is the better design hypothesis. Not that you have to go for a design hypothesis, but if you're going to go, that's the better version.
Yeah. I mean, I get the appeal in trying to explain the problem of evil, right? I was in college for a while. I was very interested in process theology, and I studied abroad at Oxford. And I asked, could I take a tutorial on process theology? And they were like, no, we don't have anybody who can teach that in the college. So then I don't know, maybe I'd be a process theology person if only I'd taken that tutorial. But I guess. Yeah, I mean, a couple things. I guess it seems like there's always going to be some trade-off between simplicity or other factors affecting theoretical virtues or whatever, and fit with the data. So it's not like you always go one way or the other. There's some sort of trade-off. There's maybe no algorithmic way to do it. I guess it seems to me like in the panpsychism case, you know, I would have thought it was an advantage that if your view doesn't imply that light switches are conscious or whatever, but IIT is maybe simpler. Yeah. So, you know, we both probably maybe go different ways in different contexts. It does seem to me, I guess I think that, yeah. So one question will be, can we get like a limited God view that explains the data we want to explain and also doesn't face the problem of evil so badly, and also is like tolerably simple, right? I guess I do kind of think that your version of the limited God view is maybe worse from the perspective of simplicity than you think. When we think about, you know, like the actual formalism that's in the laws of physics, it seems just like pretty weird, pretty arbitrary that like that specific formalism God is stuck with. And particularly, you might think there's something, I don't know, particularly repugnant about, you know, arbitrariness and complexity at like the level of the fundamental and the necessary. So if God is like the fundamental explanatory thing, it's particularly weird that there's sort of this handicap. And if God is necessary and has God's properties necessarily, as you might think, because of the cosmological argument or whatever, then that also might make it weirder. But yeah, I guess there's also a question about fit with evidence. So of course, if you think that there's evidence of like divine intervention in the form of miracles or religious experience or whatever, then that's going to become a lot more complicated because, well, if God can intervene sometimes, why not other times? But supposing we don't lean on that for now. One problem, so I'll say one problem about evil and then one problem about natural laws. I don't want to put a lot of weight on this, but it might not be obvious that the limited God does better with respect to evil, because the omni-God, there's this question of why this rather than a better world. The limited God, there's the question of why this rather than nothing, or like no complex life, right? Omnitheism does better with why this rather than nothing, because the world will probably be a lot better in the long run if God exists, right? Because all the, I don't know, quintillions of beings that have gotten screwed over throughout the course of history have some sort of hope. They could, there's might be an afterlife where maybe some good is brought out of this or whatever. Whereas for the limited God, they're just kind of regrettable casualties, right? So it's not obvious how that shakes out. Will the world, assuming that there is no God, be good on balance, thinking about everything that's ever happened over time? But there might be some respect in which omnitheism has an advantage with regard to that question. And then thinking about like the question of formalism. So this was sort of inspired by Tyler Hildebrand and Thomas Metcalf have this paper about the nomological argument for theism. So people can go subscribe to my YouTube channel and watch this interview that I did with them. But if you think about like all the possible formalisms that there could be, think about like every universe history that's allowable by a Humean recombination principle or something like that. And like, the formalisms that would govern the laws in all those universes. It might seem like the overwhelming majority of possible formalisms will just generate nonsense. They'll just be weird conjunctive property, like however you fill in the constants and things, they'll just generate nonsense. Whereas like the simplest possible formalisms would not be complex enough to generate anything interesting. They'd just be formalisms like all F's are G's, or the physics that run a game of Pong or something like that. Or if it's possible for those to generate something interesting, then they wouldn't constrain the limited God, because the only formalism I need to respect is all F's or G's, and I can do whatever else I want. So you might think, on this view, if God is just kind of stuck with some formalism, and we haven't been given any reason to explain why is God stuck with this formalism, either we should just distribute, like a priori, what formalism is God going to be stuck with? We should just distribute like evenly across, or we should distribute maybe with some bias towards very simple forms. And neither of those is going to predict formalism like the sort we have, which is able to generate from like relative simplicity a lot of interesting phenomenon, but not just crazy nonsense, enough stability and order that you have agents persisting through time and that sort of stuff. Whereas omnitheism maybe does a better job predicting it, because God can pick what formalism to institute, and if the world where interesting things happen, there's something good about that rather than just crazy nonsense or the Pong game. There would be some reason for God to favor that over other formalisms. So maybe omnitheism does better with respect to explaining why it is that the formalism we have has this character of being able to generate a wide variety of diverse, interesting phenomena without just generating a total chaotic mess or something like that. So I don't know. I said a bunch of stuff there, I guess.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I should have brought a pen. Uh, no, that's really interesting, and I might have to partly think more about this because, I mean, a lot of people say, "Oh, isn't there a kind of a fine-tuning problem with a limited God, like that they're not more or less powerful, that they've got exactly this kind of power?" And then my response has been, "Oh, okay, but why is that needing explanation?" But I think what you're pressing there is maybe a reason why the kind of power the limited God has might need explanation, and partly I might need to think more about this. But I suppose part of this is we're kind of drifting into the cosmological argument, and I don't think I would feel any motivation towards theism or anything goddish without the fine tuning. If it was just physics and it wasn't fine tuned, I don't think I'd feel the pull of, because we don't know how simple physics is going to end up. We're not at the final theory, and with respect to this thought, well, when we're talking about, so I do feel, as I know Emerson has said as well, that I feel the pull of the cosmological argument to the extent that there must be something that exists necessarily, or that can explain its own existence, or something to explain why there is something rather than nothing, why there is anything at all. I mean, the idea that there's just the fundamental thing just is, and there's no explanation of why it exists, I do find problematic. I'm sort of working on an argument on this actually that I might talk about at some point, but I need to think about it more. But then the part I have trouble with is where you try to move from that to the specific characteristics of the omnigod. Now, okay, I see that the omnigod. So you said, well, at the fundamental level, don't we want to get rid of the arbitrariness? Don't we want? I mean, maybe the more simple you can get the fundamental starting point, the less there is to explain, and the less you have that question, why does this thing exist? But you never quite get rid of it, right? There's even the omnigod, as far as I understand the omnigod, the idea of the omnigod, I'd still have the question, why does that exist? Why does it exist rather than not exist at all? I mean, I think the ultimate cause, the ultimate necessary being, must somehow explain its own nature in a way we just have absolutely no comprehension of. We don't understand how a thing could explain its own nature. I'm so kind of a Mysterian. Colin McGinn was famously defending Mysterianism about consciousness. Like, there is just a perfectly fine explanation, but our minds just can't wrap around it. I kind of feel that about the ultimate cause. There must be something that explains its own existence, and maybe it's like quite straightforward. It's not like, but we just can't understand how something could explain its own existence. Maybe it's a bit like the opposite of an impossible being. Like, we understand how a square circle can explain its non-existence. So maybe it's like the opposite of that. It's something, if you understood its nature, you'd say, oh yeah, that has to exist, but we just can't positively comprehend something like that. So when we never, this kind of drive for simplicity, we never totally get rid of the need to say, oh, why is this something rather than nothing? The need to ask that. So we just try and get as simple as we can. And physics, we try and get physics simpler. We get it as simple as we can, fitting with the data. So so it's only really once you bring the fine tuning in that you start, to my mind, we start to get pushed beyond just stopping with the physics. But I don't know whether that totally answers all of your issues.
Yeah. I don't think it addresses the kind of nomological fine tuning argument that I wanted to raise.
Can you say it again?
Oh, sorry.
Go on. Say what you're going to say.
I just wanted to say one thing. Yeah, I sort of agree that maybe it has to be that the fundamental thing has like a self-explaining nature, such that if you really could grasp it, you would see why it has to be. I guess I sort of agree, like, yeah, we don't quite know what that is. I guess it seems like there are maybe more and less plausible candidates for what such a nature might be like. And it seems less plausible the more complexity and arbitrariness there is. And that might be kind of an advantage in favor of omnitheism over limited views. The argument about formalism was something like, look, it seems like most possible formalisms, or at least this seems plausible to me, most conceivable formalisms that the physical laws could have would not allow, like, I mean, they would just kind of generate nonsense, or maybe they would be so complicated that they would be consistent with anything, or, whereas the simplest ones either would be so constraining that nothing interesting could happen, or they would not be constraining at all, because it would just be like, this is the form of the law, all F's or G's, like God can do anything as long as we fill in all F's or G's or something like that. And so the thought is, there's something striking about the fact that we have formalism such that when the constants are filled in the right way, you can get like an interesting world that is complicated enough to have beings like us, but not just sort of like a crazy nonsense world of the sort that you would expect, like most universes that you just algorithmically generated through Humean recombination to be. And so it might be because Omnigod can pick the formalism, and there's something valuable about this formalism. Whereas the limited designer view, if the idea is sort of stuck with a formalism, we don't have an a priori reason to predict one formalism rather than another, and then has to fill in laws. It seems awfully lucky that the limited designer, and maybe this could be true for axiarchism and some of these other views too, it seems pretty lucky that they got a formalism that allows, an interesting range of possibilities, complicated agents in a stable environment, people with, whatever. It seems lucky that they got that kind of formalism. That view doesn't seem to predict that they get that sort of formalism unless we just build it in, which lowers the prior probability. Whereas omnitheism, maybe the probability is going to be higher because God can pick the formalism, and there's something good about that kind of formalism.
It's really interesting. I will need to think more about this, and I will watch your video. It almost sounds like you're just saying, you're trying to say there's another kind of fine-tuning in physics apart from,
something like that. I mean, that's sort of what their argument is in a way. Yeah.
I guess I'm so almost like just even before we discovered the fine-tuning from the kind of 70s onwards, just the facts of physics would incline us that direction. I guess I'm not. So as I would say it, right, if what the Omnigod can do, sorry, not Omnigod, my guy, the limited God,
yeah.
What they're limited to, if you just take physics and take the numbers out, you've got a kind of form there. I found this very hard to explain in the book. The publisher kept saying, I don't understand what you're talking about. I think I managed to anyway. So you got a kind of form there, and the Omnigod is limited to that form. Basically, they can fiddle with the numbers. So that's just sort of kind of physics, but without the numbers. And it doesn't, I guess it hasn't occurred to me that physics without the numbers would be fine-tuned, that kind of abstract the form of physics. But maybe there's something I'm missing here. But just moving to the more general cosmological problem. So cosmological argument rather. Yeah, I mean, I agree with you that there are more or less plausible candidates to be the ultimate cause, and it's something to do with simplicity. So I like Josh Rasmussen's example. I referred to it in my book of, it would be weird if the fundamental thing was shaped like a Disney princess, sort of like exactly like. So, but the problem is, if the omni-god got rid of all the arbitrariness, if the ontological argument worked, or then okay. But it no hypothesis we can come up with gets totally rid of the desire to say, but why that? You know, maybe we feel less the need to say why that. So that's why it's the simpler the entity is, you know, the better. But given that it never goes away, okay, we can go for the simplest thing we can imagine, but it still wouldn't go away. We can't scratch the itch. So that the moral I draw from that is, we'll just try and get as simple as you can. But you know, the important thing is to fit the data. And I mean, coming back to the problem of evil, I suppose I'm really interested in this nomenological problem you're raising to me, and I'll have to think more of it. But when I compare it to the problem of evil, I don't know, you know, you've got to weigh these things, and that just seems, you know, a lot more compelling than these more abstract, nuanced worries. But we'll definitely think more about it.
Can I get some clarity on the argument? It seems like the crucial part is over God's relationship to the laws of nature. Like on one view, God didn't create at least some of the laws of nature. They might be brute or they might be necessary, but they're just kind of over there, as it were, like God didn't create them. And then on an alternative view, God can be their explanation. And it sounds like Philip is saying that, you know, the limited designer did sort of select the laws, but that, you know, they couldn't just select any, you know, any set of laws.
They were limited by, they were sort of stuck with the mathematical form of the laws, and then they could put in values for the constants and things like that.
Okay. But so it doesn't, it's like, even though the limited God is kind of selecting the laws, you think this argument still applies?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking it might not, if you think, you know, step back from like the level that a physicist is thinking about it and just think of like all the possible forms that laws could have. It seems like it might be kind of lucky, like most of I don't know, I haven't sat down and worked this out, but it seems plausible to me that most of the laws would either just generate total chaos. You know, you imagine like take every possible state of the universe, of any universe, and just like shuffle them all up, and that's a possible universe history that you could get through a Humean recombination principle. And I guess there's some formalism that governs such a universe, right? It seems like most formalisms either would be, they would like require that there be nonsense, or they wouldn't constrain you very much at all, or they wouldn't allow for kind of interesting things to happen. And so that we have a formalism, the mere fact that the formalism is such that by putting in the right numbers, you can get interesting results. That might be some reason to prefer omnitheism. That's my thought. I don't know. I haven't told anybody else about that. Maybe I'm totally wrong. This is just a thought.
Yeah, it sounds like you're saying the form is fine-tuned.
Yeah.
I think.
Or in a way, yeah.
I guess I would just add one or two things. One is that, you know, even if God can't pick them, there might be sort of deeper reasons. Like I remember, or like we were saying earlier, like if you could really understand, you know, foundational reality, you would kind of grasp like why it couldn't fail to exist or something. But I remembered this one example from Richard Dawkins, actually, where he was talking about how when he was 5, he basically just had to take adults' word for it, that the internal angles of a triangle always added up to 180 degrees. He was like, that just didn't make any sense to me. And I thought, like, you know, I accepted it because like adults told me, but it, you know, he's like, I couldn't appreciate the deeper reason why that was the case until I was a little bit older. And I kind of wonder if, you know, I mean, I know it's totally speculative, but if there's something similar going on, I mean, it doesn't seem crazy with like this kind of more fundamental area of laws of nature, that there are kind of deeper reasons that things have to be a certain way. And then this limited designer is kind of choosing among different possible sets of laws, and none of them are perfect. But, you know, like they go with the one that's, you know, the least bad, all things considered. But there are sort of like deep reasons that, you know, we can't really understand. Like Dawkins couldn't understand, you know, geometry when he was that young.
Yeah. So I guess it's I mean, the if it's necessary, then yeah, we have an explanation, I guess, assuming that maybe we need an explanation why it's necessary or something. If it's necessary, then omnitheism, I guess, solves the problem too, right? Maybe the omnitheist God could intervene in nature constantly but at least the omnitheist would then have an explanation for why the world has laws of the form that it does, right? Because that has to be how they are. I guess I worry that sort of view, it has the same sorts of drawbacks of just saying maybe the constants are necessary, if we haven't been given a reason to think that, then like epistemically, in terms of epistemic possibility, the view that the constants are necessary doesn't predict fine tuning, right? Because, it could be anything and be necessary. If we build in specifically what the constants are, then, this is the same thing that we say in our paper about type B physicalism, right? If we build in what the constants are to the theory, they're necessary and they're this, well, then that doesn't provide an advantage over just saying, my theory is the constants are finely tuned, it doesn't really explain it. And so, I guess absent some reason to think that this would be the necessary formalism, it doesn't seem that the theory gains predictive power by saying that the laws are necessary. And there maybe are other reasons to think that they're not, just because it seems like you can easily conceive of different forms and that sort of thing.
I guess that's why I liked the geometry analogy, because those seem, like mathematical truths seem like plausible, necessary truths that no one really has a problem with, quote unquote, limiting God in that way. Like, unless you're, Descartes or Martin Luther, then you're happy with, limiting God in some ways. Like, you can't do things that are nonsense or like logically impossible or whatever. So I guess I was thinking more along those lines, more so than like, the kind of necessity that like type B physicalists are talking about, like sort of mathematical necessity. But I don't know. I haven't thought about this argument as much as you have.
I haven't thought about it all that much. I mean, this is just an idea I had thinking about Tom and Tyler's paper. But yeah, I guess if it's mathematical necessity, there's still going to be the issue of like, we don't see what the mathematical necessity is. And so just the view that there's mathematical necessity, given our knowledge, doesn't predict this form.
What you said was interesting. I should have brought a pen. The advantage of omnitheism, if you have an afterlife, is, it makes it more plausible that it's worthwhile. Two things in response to that. I mean, I think even assuming there isn't an afterlife, I still think I would say the problem of evil pretty much goes away if the limited designer's choices were this or nothing. I think most people, unless you're an anti-natalist, I think most people would think overall it's good, it's better, that there's nature as we find it than nothing. I think that's pretty plausible. But you might be able to marry a limited God to an afterlife. As you say, process theologians try to go this way. Thomas, I don't know, is it Thomas Ord or Thomas Oord?
Yeah,
how do you put the pronunciation? Anyway,
okay. I've always pronounced it Ord, but I could just...
Ord, that's probably right. Yeah. I think I'm thinking of the Doctor Who creatures, the Ood. Anyway, he tries to make sense of a God of limited powers, and then he tries to say, well, and the miracles point as well. How can the God of limited powers do a resurrection and a virgin birth, but can't, bring people back to life more generally, or deal with people's conceiving problems more generally? And I don't. I might write a paper on this. Actually, I've been thinking about it just as a sort of intellectual exercise. I don't think his way of trying to solve this works, because he says, well, maybe one thing he says, maybe God can work in quantum indeterminacy, but if God could do anything where there's any quantum mechanical chance of it happening, that would make God practically omnipotent, because there's a very small quantum mechanical chance that I'm gonna fly to the clouds right now. Maybe that's not right, but anyway, there's
all sorts of weird stuff.
All sorts of weird things.
Super.
Yeah. So, but maybe there's some way of making sense of God, I mean, maybe this limited God can preserve our conscious minds after death. I don't know. It's not totally obvious that that this would rule, that this is inconsistent with the traditional Abrahamic faiths, for example. But but it's tricky. If it's not just deism, it's gonna be more of a challenge having a fairly simple hypothesis where God can do some intervening and give us an afterlife and so on.
Yeah. I agree with that. It's not obvious. It's just there's a lot of work to be done to show how is it that God can bring about an afterlife that is good. It presumably is better than this, but couldn't make this better. Given there are also these additional problems about how do you get the person to the afterlife, all that sort of stuff. I'm not an anti-natalist. I do think it's hard to know. I think it's easier to know that like anti-natalism for humans is false. I think it's quite difficult to know, thinking about the whole scope of all sentient beings.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Whether it's been good or bad up to this point. And unfortunately, humans are only the tiniest slice of that. I have the EA techno-optimist hope that the future will be really good if we only make the right decisions. But it's not been all that much to write home about at certain points so far.
What do you think, Emerson? How do you explain psychophysical harmony?
I don't really know. I mean, I'm kind of like weighing this kind of like natural teleology against some of the other explanations. I would like to make it work without God, mostly for the same reasons that you've been talking about, mainly evil. But there are some versions of theism that are not totally implausible to me. It's just that they're kind of few and far between and believed by 17 people like Dustin and David Bentley Hart and not that many. And anyway, it's just like, it's very hard for me to make it like fit together. It feels like I am like literally made so I can't believe in God. And I've tried to think about this from a theistic perspective, like, is there any reason God might have for making people who don't believe in him? And I feel like I've come up with some decent answers for that. So it's like, it's not like even that's a huge problem. Like, I really feel like I just can't believe in God. And it's like, well, I can kind of come up with some decent reasons for why God might create people like that, provided you don't accept any idiotic view like eternal conscious torment. So it's not that I think that theism is like impossible, but if I could make it work without theism, that would be a lot more intellectually satisfying to me, because I think theism just has other problems. But we also haven't talked about some of the objections that people raise to theism as an explanation for psychophysical harmony, like the unlimited theism. I do think that the revenge problem is interesting, even though the way that they set it up in the paper kind of precludes that objection, which is a point I didn't really understand. Brian helped me understand it more when I spoke to him. But still, I feel like it's a little bit selective to be like puzzled by psychophysical harmony in this case, but not be puzzled by the harmony that would be in the divine mind. Even though it's totally true, like, hey, this is a simple explanation this is a simple theory that explains the data as a reasonable prior probability. Yeah, all that's true, but it still feels kind of like selective puzzlement to me. To kind of not wonder, like, hey, isn't there something resembling harmony in the divine mind? Like, there are these conceivably disharmonious scenarios. Like, shouldn't we wonder why those didn't obtain? Anyway, so maybe that's a promising route, like maybe not. But yeah, at the end of the day, I guess I prefer natural teleology mostly for the reasons that I just don't like theism that much because it has other like unrelated problems. It's not like I think the revenge problem, like, oh, well, then theism can't be the explanation of psychophysical harmony. It's mostly this other stuff.
I do agree. You should wonder about those things. I don't say you shouldn't wonder about them. We think we have something that addresses it, basically. But.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I'm still open to like limited, this like limited designer stuff is interesting to me, especially, the way you're pairing it with like rational matter and all that. Because there are some Christians who believe something almost exactly like that. But I was going to say that it's too bad that you didn't get into process philosophy, Dustin, because um, then you could constantly yell at Philip for not taking it into account, for not taking Whitehead into account.
Yeah, Whiteheadians always shout at me. I mean, I always feel like I feel a kinship, a common intellectual kinship with Whitehead, but I don't know. It's all the sort of I never get when I talk to Whiteheadians. I never really feel I get a satisfying explanation for why all of the intricacies of the system are crucial and ineliminable, and it just seems like they'd have to sort of keep the whole thing. It's like the hardcore IIT people have to keep the whole system, and we're not going to change it, and so that's what frustrates me a bit. I think it's a nice idea, but I don't get why. Yeah, well, I'm repeating myself, but yeah, it's a cool and neglected, little understood by people's, how people think about religion in the general populace. It's too little known about process theology, I think.
You guys have both been extremely generous with your time, and it's starting to get late over where Philip is, at least. So is there anything in closing that you guys want to offer before we sign off?
I don't really think so. I enjoyed the discussion. Thanks for your time, Philip and Emerson.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Emerson and Dustin. I'm going to think more about your nomenological problem, and I really do think this psychophysical harmony stuff is going to change the world. I think the problem is it's a bit of a subtle argument. You want to say, there's two things. You want to say, that doesn't need explaining, because it seems like such an obvious mundane fact. Unlike the cosmological fine-tuning, when people hear about that, they think, instantly you think that needs explaining. But like, why does pain make you avoid stuff? It's like, duh. And also because people think, it's evolution's gonna, but I think people will get this, and I do think it's gonna change the world. I mean, I think part of the problem is people just don't think about consciousness enough, but it's exciting stuff, and it's
what is the title of your forthcoming book, and when do you think it'll be out?
So yes, it is going to be called, the publisher want to call it Why, subtitle The Purpose of the Universe. What do you guys think about this? Some of my friends and colleagues think people will just think it's a standard defense of Christianity or something, whereas I want to, it's supposed to be in a way a middle way between omni-God and atheism. That was the original subtitle, was between God and atheism. But what do you think about that title? Do you think a lot of people will just say, that's just about Jesus or something?
I suppose the publisher rejected my plagiaristic title of The Purpose-Driven Universe. So
I liked that. I liked that. I thought it was a little bit, I don't know, a little bit too, I don't know the word, not catchy enough in some way or something for a book aimed at general audience. But
I after reading a couple of the chapters that you've sent, to be honest, I had no idea to expect what was in the book. I love what's in the book, but yeah, I would not have guessed that that's what it was about based on the title and subtitle, for sure.
So what would you have guessed? What would you have thought it was about? From that title.
I mean, yeah, something related to God, I guess. But when I'm reading about pan-agentialism and kind of the bottom-up approach that you're taking to, and there's just, I can't convey to the listeners enough. There are so many just bizarre and interesting twists and turns.
That chapter is the most kind of challenging and philosophical, and I think it's maybe the more original bit of the book. But
yeah, chapter 5 is my favorite part for sure. But yeah, I would not have guessed that was in there based on because it's a really radical conception of nature, and it's really interesting. But it's hard to know how to give a title that's hey, here's what this is going to be about. I don't really even know what it is. But
I am still a little bit worried about it. Anyway, it's going to be out in November, I think. They promised me it's going to be this calendar year, but What do you think of that title, Dustin? Sorry, we can edit this out. This
Oh yeah, so
sorry.
it's what is it? It's why the purpose of the universe, is that the title?
Yeah, subtitle The Purpose of the Universe.
I think your older subtitle got the idea across better. I guess I worry why the purpose of the universe. It doesn't sound to me like a Christian book. It sounds to me like The Secret or something. You know, almost like a kind of new agey type. You know, it's a little obscure, but it's, you know, it's kind of like that's what I think that would be my, like, if I just saw that and didn't have any idea who you were, but I saw that on like the airport shelf, I think that would be my thought. So
I worry Between God and Atheism might make a bit too niche, like for, I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't know. It's really hard. But sorry, did I interrupt you there, Dustin? Or
no. I was just
right.
Do you want me to cut this part out? Like, is this, because I'm happy with leaving it in unless you want me to take it out.
I'm happy to leave it in, but I just worry it'll bore people, this 5-minute discussion about my book title.
At this point, they've already watched for 2 hours. So
They're committed, yeah.
You must be willing to put up with us.
Yeah, we got the real heads with us at this point. Like, we can say anything we want. It's only the people who really like the three of us who are going to even be watching at this point.
Or really hate us and enjoy feeling the hatred of this nonsense we're talking.
That seems to be a significant faction of my audience, actually. So,
but yeah, I probably should go to bed. The problem is I can't wind down after these things. So yeah.
Well, thank you guys so much for coming on. Really, really enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and I'll be thinking about this conversation for a while. So yeah, thanks again. And for the people listening, links to their work and their channels and so on is in the show notes. Yeah, thank you for listening.
Thanks, Emerson. Doing great stuff.